Let's work through a couple evaluations of trigonometric functions at given angles. Let's start with sine of 3 pi by 4. The first thing that's probably helpful to do here is draw a quick picture, noting where 3 pi by 4 is in the xy plane. We know if we begin at the positive x-axis and go all the way over here, this is going to be an angle of 4 pi by 4, which tells us 3 pi by 4 must be somewhere inside quadrant 2. So let's go ahead and mark that in. Now, if we assume that this length here is equal to 1, then this point that I've drawn is actually on the unit circle. And sine of 3 pi by 4 is the y-coordinate of this particular point on the unit circle. Now what we're hoping to do is relate this back to a point on the unit circle that's inside of quadrant 1. Well, notice that there's a point on the unit circle over here that shares a similar reference angle of pi by 4. And we know the y-coordinate of this particular point on the unit circle. So it must be that sine of 3 pi by 4 is equivalent to sine of pi by 4. And we should have these special values committed to memory. What is the y-coordinate at pi by 4? Well, this is the square root of 2 over 2. The cast rule allows us to double check to make sure that the sign of our final answer makes sense. Since we're in quadrant 2, by the cast rule, I know that the sine function is going to be positive inside of this quadrant. That means when I go through and evaluate sine of 3 pi by 4, I expect my final answer to be positive, which it is. Next, let's evaluate cosine of 4 pi by 3. If we begin along the positive x-axis and measure in this direction, we know that when we get to here, this is 3 pi by 3, which tells us that 4 pi by 3 must be somewhere inside of the third quadrant. So let's go ahead and mark that in. We also know that this angle here is going to be pi by 3. If we assume that this distance here is equal to 1, then this point is going to lie on the unit circle, and cosine of 4 pi by 3 is going to be the x-coordinate of this point on the unit circle. If we'd like to evaluate this, we want to relate this to one of our special angles inside of the first quadrant. How can we do this? Well, there's a point on the unit circle in the first quadrant that has the same reference angle as our angle that we're looking at. How are the x-coordinates of this point and this point related to each other? Well, they're actually opposite. If I look at the x-coordinate of this point, it's going to be a negative x value, and if I look at the x-coordinate of this point, it's going to be a positive x value. This tells us that cosine of 4 pi by 3 is going to be related to cosine of pi by 3, except that these two x values are going to be opposites of each other. We know that cosine of pi by 3 is 1/2, so negative cosine of pi by 3 is going to be negative 1/2. And once again, we can use the cast rule here to double check to make sure the sign of our final answer makes sense. Since 4 pi by 3 is here in quadrant 3, the tangent function is exclusively positive in this quadrant, which means that cosine is going to be negative in this particular quadrant, and that is reflected here in our final answer.